Welcome, everybody. My name is Mikey Mhenna. I'm excited to invite our special guest onto the program. Khaled Beydoun is a leading scholar on national security, the war on terror, and civil rights. He's the author of the critically acclaimed American Islamophobia, Understanding the Roots and Rise of Fear, and a co-editor of Islamophobia and the Law, a critical reader published by Cambridge University Press. Khaled is active and publishes on many different platforms. We are very excited to have him here both as a scholar, a lawyer, and a social media fiend, even though he thinks he is bad at Instagram. I know better. Khaled, welcome to afikra.
Thanks, Mikey. Thanks so much for having me. I wish I was in Beirut with you instead of here on Zoom.
Yeah, well, I do too. So Khaled, you are calling from Detroit, a city that you grew up in. I'm curious, what was your childhood like as a kid growing up in Detroit? And when did you first start thinking about Islamophobia?
Yeah, so I grew up in between the west side of Detroit and Dearborn, which are pretty much adjacent. And Detroit and Dearborn, obviously is home to a really big concentrated Arab American community, Muslim American communities. Growing up primarily in the 80s and then in the 90s, it was a pre 9/11 era. There was still some, animus, discrimination towards Arab and towards Muslims. Islamophobia at that juncture wasn't yet a cogent and sort of well-developed phenomenon. It was largely framed as anti-Arab racism, or what Edward Said calls Orientalism. But growing up in my community was largely Black and Arab, but whenever I would encounter, white folks beyond my community, there was always this sort of animus or aversion to Arab identity or to Muslim identity. And that sort of rooted in me really at a young age that I was different, not only on racial grounds, but also on religious grounds. And even though I didn't sort of have the, I guess, like vocabulary or intellectual capacity to understand what that was, I knew that it was something that I wanted to interrogate, analyze, study, and then obviously things evolved into a career in law in focus on Islamophobia.
Yeah. What do you think if I was speaking to the sort of 18-year-old Khaled who maybe had a copy of Orientalism on their bookshelf? What do you feel like you fundamentally misunderstood about Islamophobia as a teenager, even intellectually, that you may have understood instinctually? What did you intellectually misunderstand about Islamophobia?
It's a good question. So the 18-year-old Khaled was a knucklehead, right? So, I wasn't a good student. I wasn't academically inclined until my, I guess, like my 20s, like my 20 or 21. But I guess I still had an intellectual curiosity and racial justice. I think the thing that I wouldn't understand then, that is really salient to understanding and framing Islamophobia today, is how deeply rooted it is in the American experience and how American law perpetuates it and is, in my opinion, is the principal spearhead of it. And the third thing is, I understood white supremacy and, white inflicted and enforced racism in sort of broad terms then. But I didn't understand how white supremacy as a broader sort of foundation of the American experience roots and drives what we understand as Orientalism and Islamophobia today. So I think those are the things that I didn't know fully well then.
Yeah.
I was too dumb. Yeah, I wouldn't understand Orientalism, man. That's too difficult to text.
So, but interesting. So just doing this sort of mental math, did you sort of, do you feel like your scholarship was born on 9/11?
So I think after 9/11, I wasn't fully developed yet, or, even intellectually mature enough at that juncture to even think about myself as a scholar, right?
Yeah.
That came much later. I will say this though, I think that my scholarly curiosity grew out of the works, ironically enough, of formative Black thinkers, right? So people like James Baldwin. The first book that I remember reading as a kid that shook me and that really moved me to want to become an academic and sort of a thinker was Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver. I remember picking up that book at the library, not even knowing what it meant, but the title to me sounded so cool, Soul on Ice. And the cover of that book was so compelling. And I remember reading that book and it really shook me, and it sort of like drove me to think about discrimination against Arab and against Muslims. And this is pre 9/11 in ways that aligned with the Black experience.
Yeah, it's interesting because like as an Arab who grew up outside of America or the Americas completely, when I think Islamophobia and sort of anti-Arab sentiment in a post 9/11 context, I think of them as being interchangeable, but they're absolutely not. And it feels like, now thinking, sort of zooming out a little more, it seems like Islamophobia is rooted in anti-Blackness in an American context. Is that, am I wrong about that?
Not entirely. So I wouldn't make the claim that Islamophobia is narrowly sort of rooted or connected to anti-Blackness in the United States. There are some really important overlaps with anti-Black racism. I mean, one of them is the fact that the first, and I write about this in the book, how the first community of Muslims in this country not only predate the existence of the United States as a sovereign nation, but were in fact enslaved Africans. However, given that, you know, and again, Orientalism is the mother discourse for Islamophobia. The fact that Orientalism racialized and constructed Muslim identity in largely brown, immigrant, Arab, Middle Eastern terms, enslaved Muslims weren't recognized or perceived by state actors or even slave masters as legitimate Muslims. The racialization of Muslim identity and Arab identity were deeply conflated. However, I would say that you could make the claim that American Islamophobia is seated in white supremacy. And again, there's many examples. One, really notable manifestation of that is one of the earliest laws that was enshrined in the United States immediately after the United States became a sovereign nation was this law called the Naturalization Act of 1790, which made it a prerequisite that one had to be white to become a naturalized citizen. And then back in 1790, whiteness was understood in largely religious terms. You had to be Protestant to be white. And if you were Muslim, you obviously weren't Protestant, and then you couldn't become white, and then you couldn't become a naturalized citizen.
Khaled, can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
It used that actual rhetoric, white?
Yeah. It was explicitly written into the law.
Interesting.
Yeah,
that's surprising. Very, very revealing. So while we're on this point, I want you to help in the plainest English that you can, help sort of explain to listeners, what is the difference between private Islamophobia, structural Islamophobia, and dialectic Islamophobia that you sort of outline in your book?
Okay, I'll break it down and make it plain. So private Islamophobia is the kind of Islamophobia that comes from citizens, hate mongers, bigots, people on the street, right? So people that aren't connected to government. State-sponsored or structural Islamophobia is the form of Islamophobia that is unleashed or enforced by way of law or policy. So an example would obviously, something like the Muslim ban, for instance, right? Or Patriot Act surveillance would be an instance or an example of structural Islamophobia. And then finally, Islamophobia is a dialectic, is the discourse, whether the explicit language or communication coming from the state actors like President Trump, or even laws like this law that I just mentioned, communicating to the polity or the people at large that Muslims are suspicious. And that communication from the state sort of incites or emboldens the private Islamophobia we see coming from people on the ground.
Do you, that's very, very, very helpful. So thinking about those three dimensions moving all at the same time, or sort of evolving all at the same time, if you think about the sort of the post 9/11 period, do you think the post 9/11 period ended at Trump and then there emerged a new sort of a new chapter, or are we sort of still in the same period when you think about zooming out to 10,000 feet?
Yeah, I think Trump was a symptom of the 9/11 era, right? I think if
Yeah.
not for 9/11 and the war on terror, a Trump presidency wouldn't be possible. I think that the Trump administration and Trumpism as a whole was an extension and probably the most lucid and brazen extension of the post 9/11 era. I would still claim that we're in a post 9/11 era as of now. It's been kind of disfigured and sort of mooted in some ways by the pandemic. I'm not sure how it's going to move ahead moving forward. But things like surveillance haven't stopped. Things like the backdoor Muslim ban hasn't stopped. So, the broader culture of anti-Muslim animus hasn't stopped. So I wouldn't say it's entirely been extinguished.
Yeah. I'm curious if you're hopeful. Are you a hopeful person? Are you a generally sort of optimistic person? Do you feel like, the the arc of humanity is long, but sort of bends towards justice? Do you feel that sense?
I think it's kind of funny you mention that, because when people meet me, they're like, "Oh, I didn't expect somebody to be so like positive and optimistic."
Mm-hmm.
I have a pretty positive disposition in general. I wouldn't say that I believe that the arc of justice bends forward. As a critical race theorist, I actually feel otherwise. I think that progress is dictated by distinct political interests.
How does, say more about that? So how does that actually play out given where we are right now?
Oh, it's good. Oh man, I can answer that so many ways. So
Go.
So I'll give you one example, right? So obviously now there is considerable interest in diversity and inclusion, right? You see it developing as an entire industry. So that demonstrates how corporations, government agencies have been able to sort of co-opt the Black Lives Matter movement in ways that benefit their bottom lines, right? So there's that demonstrates in ways in which power or gatekeepers of power are able to harness transformative radical movements in ways that are palatable to them, and even more than palatable to them, profitable for them.
Yeah. I mean, so this is, I need you to help me sort of think through something. So I'm very much asking for a friend here. So one of our core values in afikra is interest over identity, right? Which for me is like fundamental to how we're trying to build this movement. Whereas I really don't care what somebody's identity is, identities plural, what they are. I care where they're invested. How are they spending their time? To quote Biggie, tell me what your interests are, who you be with. Like, where are you actually like invested? What do you have a stake in? And I feel like that rubs up against in the wrong way current discourse a lot that seems to like be all about identity. I guess as somebody who thinks about this very critically and spends a lot of time trying to understand how to move the needle forward, how do you reconcile those two things? How do you sort of think about justice and not getting too hung up in identity, but also understanding the structural nature of these systems of injustice?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think that's something I struggle with myself when thinking about pressing issues today, is even as a critical race theorist, right? Because much of our work as crits over the last 2 decades is to highlight and emphasize the salience of race and the importance of identity. I think that things have sort of snowballed in a way that is dangerous, because we live in a moment now, I think, where identity has become a zero-sum commodity that supplants the importance of substance, right? So you see people championing individuals largely because they fit a sort of a subordinated or oppressive classification. We want to support an individual along lines of because he or she are Black, or he or she are queer, or he or she are Muslim, and as a consequence of them belonging to a victimized group or an intersectionally victimized collective of groups, the substance of what they're saying matters less than the identity. I would say that that is sort of emblematic of a more concerning moment that we find ourselves in, where nuance and discourse and substance has been entirely dissipated by this moment of like polarized identitarianism. I think that identitarianism has something that the right has used for a long time. The left now, unfortunately, has clung on to it. I think identity is still important. The racial identity, the ethnic, religious, gendered identity of the individual still matters. But I would say that substance matters more, like what's actually coming out of their mouths or what they're actually standing for. I'm not going to champion somebody just because they're Muslim or just because they belong to a religious or ethnic minority group, right?
Yeah.
For me, the substance of the content or the platform of what they stand for is far more important.
Yeah.
So when people say, for instance, like I get in trouble from the young woke folks all the time for saying this, but you'll hear them say things like white people shouldn't be able to talk about Muslim or Black issues. I disagree. I think that, of course, as marginalized minority groups, we need everybody talking on our issues. You know what I mean? Regardless of what the race is. And look, another thing is, and this might sound provocative, but identity isn't expertise. You belonging to a specific racial, ethnic, or political group doesn't give you automatic sort of knowledge or specialized expertise in that area just because you racially or ethnically or religiously belong to that group. I'm Muslim. I know I'm not an expert on Sharia, right? I can tell you very little on Sharia law.
Yeah, for sure. Speaking about, I want to talk about the first word in this title, American. One of the interesting things, like you spent a bunch of time in the States, in the Arab world. One of the things I'm interested in is how sort of the discourse within the US can dominate a global discourse. Mm-hmm. And so the discourse about Islamophobia in the US, American Islamophobia, can sort of dominate the global discourse about Islamophobia. And in some ways, it's easy and sort of lazy for some people to sort of click and drag the same experience over everywhere, right? I'd love to hear you sort of explain the differences, if you feel qualified to explain the differences about Islamophobia in the American context and what that actually looks like globally, and what the key differences are for people who are interested in understanding why this isn't just called Islamophobia.
Yeah, again, a really important question that hones in on a dissonance that this book, and then inshallah my next book, really homes in on. My next book will examine global Islamophobia, obviously, as it unfolds in places across the world, places like France, India, China, so forth and so on. So when you talk about discourse, it's important I'm a law professor, so I think about discourse in ways that is tied to law. And it's important to understand that the American Islamophobic project, which is in fact an imperial project, was spearheaded and fueled by the global war on terror, right? So it wasn't a distinctly American project. It was something that the Bush administration, the Obama administration, and the Trump administration, now the Biden administration, looked to sort of expand and to export on a global scale. So we saw the language of the war on terror, things like terrorism, see something, say something, radicalization, extremism, that American vocabulary that was, part of the broader Islamophobia playbook or lexicon was being peddled and exported to countries abroad, which is why it's no surprise that if you look at what's happening in India right now, they use that very same language to classify or to indict Muslims on the ground. They do the same language in China, France, and so forth and so on. So the American discourse of Islamophobia was exported and globalized by this global war on terror. However, the latter part of your question is a really important one, because I really struggle with this broader sort of phenomenon of American exceptionalism and to view things specifically from an American lens. And one really disconcerting thing that I've noticed that's tied to American exceptionalism is the imposition of American racialization or racial classifications on places where they don't necessarily apply. And second, applying an American Islamophobic prism in ways that erase the sort of like indigenous or distinct political currents in different countries, right? So obviously, American Islamophobia is dramatically different than French Islamophobia. France has a very different, a far more intimate experience with Islam and Muslim populations than the United States does. So I say that, and I can talk for hours about this, obviously. You know, professor, we're long-winded as professors.
It's all right, do your thing.
But I'll say this, is that it's important to understand that American Islamophobia was a language exported by the War on Terror. However, there are critical distinctions in the distinct Islamophobic episodes or projects happening in other countries, which I'm happy to talk about if you want to hone in on one.
Yeah, it would actually be helpful to sort of hone in on one to give it a little bit of an example.
Yeah, so let's talk about France, right? So obviously and France is very timely because we have the runoff between Macron and Le Pen coming on the 24th, I believe it is. So French Islamophobia is dramatically different, right? And I was talking to a friend last night about this, how we can think about like we were talking about earlier, American Islamophobia is deeply tied to two sort of existential state-making experiences tied to the American experience, which would be the ethnic cleansing of Native Americans and the slavery of chattel slaves, African slaves brought in, right? Islamophobia is tied to that. In France, however, I think that the state-making project that defines modern French identity would be the colonization of Algeria, right?
The colonial project.
Exactly, the colonial project in Algeria, and that how that sort of like solidified and defined what it means to be French and white, and but also on the opposite side, defined what it means to be Muslim, Arab, and North African, right? French Islamophobia is far more long-standing, deep-seated. It has a far more complex relationship with Islam that is connected to the Crusades in some respects, right? And Algerians, who comprise the largest plurality of Muslims in that country, came in as formerly colonized people. So there's that culture of hostility that is very profuse in the French Islamophobic experience. And the second distinction is legal. In the United States, we have the free exercise of religion clause, which would theoretically render impossible the passage of a headscarf ban, right? France doesn't have that. They have this principle of laïcité, which is enshrined secularism, which makes it very possible to pass the kind of policies that tread on or entirely eliminate the religious freedom of minority groups, including Muslims.
Yeah, super interesting. I want to talk a little bit, I want to sort of jump towards some of your work as a sort of a public intellectual and in some ways like almost like a public defender. And your Instagram, Twitter, social media broadly, you use it as a platform. I think you use it as a platform to shine light on ideas that you're sort of thinking through, mostly related to Islamophobia more broadly. But I'm curious how you approach your work on social media and what does kind of success look like? And who do you think you're even talking to on these platforms?
You know, I really don't know. I don't think I'm, like we were talking earlier, I don't think I'm very good at social media. I think that for me, I think what my calling card is as a public sort of thinker is to address issues that are being neglected in the mainstream, subaltern issues that few people, whether it's individuals of influence or outlets of influence, are addressing. Yeah. For me, as I guess just kind of like as a person, I'm most curious about issues that are being neglected or sidelined by the popular press or by popular voices. So that's kind of I would say my mandate as a social media commentator. And then second, I try to stay in my lane. I'm somebody who studies national security, counterterrorism, and Islamophobia. So I try to, in racial justice at large, so I try to address issues within that intellectual space or sphere.
Do you feel like do you check this type of stuff? Do you feel like you're getting traction globally and you're trying to sort of change the way a global audience understands America as well as your American audience understands the globe? Like, for example, you've been posting lately a lot about the sort of hypocritical response to what's happening in Ukraine, versus what has happened towards the sort of treatment towards other European Muslims. It sounds ridiculous for me to ask it, but who are you trying to speak to? Are you just sort of talking out loud and sort of getting yourself on record for your own sake to say, like, somebody needs to be talking about it. I hope somebody's listening out there. Or are you really trying to speak to somebody and sort of push the needle?
Well, I guess for me, what really triggered my engagement on social media were the Arab Spring revolutions, right? And then that's when I was transitioning into legal academia. I think 2 years later is when I got my first appointment as a law professor, and I was heavily influenced by Paulo Freire, right? Who wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed, and
sure, of course.
Being a critical race theorist, I was always someone who rejected sort of the elitism of education. I never wanted to become an academic or a scholar who only spoke to students or spoke to fancy professors stuck in an ivory tower somewhere. So I came up at a time where social media was like this ideal vehicle to be able to reach and teach lay people, right? For me, and what really, even beyond social media, what really inspired me to write this book, American Islamophobia, is I was writing all these academic articles that only a handful of academics were reading. My mom wasn't reading my academic articles, my brother wasn't reading it, my friends where I grew up were reading it. And for me, I wanted to write in a way that would reach general audiences and lay people, and social media enables that.
Yeah. This leads me to one of my favorite things that you do, which is write about sports. Can you talk a little bit about how you think sports is, why do you write about sports? And how do you think sports is, excuse the pun, sort of an arena for broader issues that are at play?
Yeah, so I just love sports, right?
Yeah.
I grew up boxing. I boxed competitively for many years. Combat sports are just my favorite sport.
Quite literally a knucklehead.
Yeah, I was a knucklehead, and I got a lot of black eyes and scratches. So, I mean, sports are interesting, right? Because on one hand, for me, sports are an escape from the bleak realities of the day, political, existential, life-wise, and so forth and so on. But they're also, like, I think, the most reflective mirror of what's happening in the specific societies in which they sit, right? French football, for instance, is a common example. American football years ago when Colin Kaepernick took a stance. And I think what's most attractive to me about sports is they're a language to relate to anybody. Almost anybody and everybody follows some form of sport, right? It's a way to connect to the layperson, the working person, and sort of like package an idea, package a message, a political message in a way that is accessible and understandable to them. The book I'm working on after this book is called The Color of Combat, which is about the intersection of combat sports, boxing and MMA, religion, and politics. I'll tell you a quick crazy story. So before the pandemic, I went to my first UFC competition.
Nice.
It's crazy, man, because it's largely a homogeneously white guy thing. It feels like a big frat party.
It's different than boxing.
Yeah. Boxing is heavily people of color in the United States, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So primarily, a lot of Black fans, a lot of Latino fans, exactly. UFC, man, it felt like a Trump rally, right? And I'm getting along with all these folks, talking about the fights. Some of them are wearing Trump stuff. So the dissonance to me was crazy. Like, these are folks who largely probably hate Arab, hate Muslims, but we can connect on something like watching the UFC. I kind of feel like an imposter in that space.
Well, it's like football, right? Like American football, in the same way. But it's interesting because like that arena is precisely where the needles can be moved, right? I wonder. I mean, like, you know, today, Muhammad Ali, if you were to poll his favorability, like his favorabilities in the States, I would imagine he's one of the, you know, most liked, most revered figures in American 20th century American history, right? Probably Kareem Abdul-Jabbar is up there, right? Wouldn't you say so? And it's interesting because like I wonder how much that sort of transitions back to the Arab world more broadly right now, right? How much culture in the U.S. actually is in interaction with the Arab world? How much the discourse that's happening there is actually going back and forth? Do you have any sense of that?
Through sport?
Yeah, through sport.
It's hard to gauge, right? Because there are some American sports that are distinctly American, right? So football, for instance, I think basketball's a global sport. A lot of what's happening in soccer or football is primarily, you know, in Europe. So it's hard to gauge. I think like there's some flashpoints, right? So people like Mohamed Salah a couple of years ago,
Yeah,
when he was really emerging in the EPL, when he would pray after scoring a goal, for instance, you know, that got a lot of attention in places like Masr, you know, Egypt, the broader Arab world, but also here in the States, did a lot of good work in sort of retrenching anti-Arab and Islamophobic stereotypes in the United States. Habib, obviously in the UFC, had this sort of like galvanizing effect on Arab. He fought in the Gulf, he fought in the Khalij for many years. He was also very inspiring here in the United States. A couple of days ago, actually, Karim Benzema, who was fasting, he scored 3 goals after fasting. That caught a lot of attention. But I wouldn't say it's deeply connected.
interesting. Yeah. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about where we are today in the U.S. The audience that is listening to this is all over the world, and in many cases, as an outsider, there looks like this idea of Trump bad, not Trump good. Yeah. From your perspective as a commentator and observer, in the context of Islamophobia and the war on terror, does that hold true? Trump bad, anyone but Trump good? Is there much of a difference? Are we seeing much of a difference?
No, I mean, I wouldn't subscribe to that binary, and I wouldn't subscribe to most any binary. I think that one of the most unfortunate structural issues with the United States is that I mean, how can you claim to be a politically pluralistic society when you only have 2 options, right? And specifically speaking for Arab, Muslim, and minority populations in the United States, none of them are good options. I think that the principal distinction is Trump is explicitly Islamophobic, which ironically enough can do some good. I think the Trump administration has sort of elevated Islamophobia into a principal racial and social justice issue as a consequence of his brazenness. The unfortunate reality is with the Democratic Party, and you know, Obama included, I wasn't smitten with President Obama, but I was sort of, you know, I laud the fact that he was the first Black president. But look, the Democratic Party, the reality is that they're neoliberal and they're driven by pointedly economic interests. And like I mentioned earlier, they use the sort of veneer and thin language of diversity and racial justice as a tool to promote the status quo, not to better the lived experiences of communities of color and subordinate groups. So both are terrible in different ways.
Yeah. So what does, I mean, who's coming up? Is your sort of prescription like, all right, let's not worry about the system as is, and sort of try to make change outside the system and not really worry about it? Or are you just hoping for better candidates and new parties and new laws?
No, so, you know, it's not a zero-sum thing. Like for me, it's not, like, I don't say that to say that individuals should sort of divest themselves from for being politically involved, right?
Yeah.
So, look, one of the reasons I voted for Biden, and I teach constitutional law, that's what I do for, a living, is because the high stakes come in the form of appointments, right? So, and the Supreme Court obviously is very significant. And we saw this past week how voting for a Democrat might be better in the sense of not always getting progressive voices behind the bench in the Supreme Court. So there are selective victories you can get with voting Democrat. There are sort of broader, how would I say this? I mean, look, I'm not trying to encourage people to vote for Trump, right?
Yeah, of course.
I don't want people to say that, right? Or make an endorsement of Biden. That's not what I'm doing here. But there are sort of like long arc benefits that come with having somebody like Trump in office, is that it exposes to individuals who are otherwise not persuaded that this country is deeply racist and deeply Islamophobic. And we have this person at the helm of government, which makes it crystal clear.
Yeah, it's like Chappelle did that whole bit about how Trump was like the picture of Emmett Till.
Yeah, I didn't see that, but it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, Trump was like the picture of Emmett Till, and that sort of birthed a generation of social justice warriors and civics right activists, and laid bare the injustice in black and white. Yeah. And so in that way, it was useful.
And I think it woke up. I mean, look, I'm not saying white folks are a homogenous monolithic block, but it sort of like woke up a lot of unconvinced white people that Islamophobia was a genuine and real phenomenon. You could make the argument that the Muslim ban and the Black Lives Matter movement were perhaps the most salient and sort of potent incidences that, created this sort of like racial consciousness momentum that we have here in the United States.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to ask you these 4 quick questions before we move on to the Q&A from the chat. So the first question is, what are you reading or watching right now?
Oh man, what am I reading right now?
No judgment.
Darren Byler, Inside the Camps, which is about the use of technology and surveillance in China. What am I watching? I'm not watching any sports. I just watched the UFC fight this past weekend.
By the way, did you enjoy it?
I did, man. Hamza won. I thought he was going to, smash him, but it was a close fight.
Cool. Who would you love to shadow for a day, past or present?
Oh, wow. Probably Anthony Bourdain.
Nice. Exactly.
Yeah.
What do people most misunderstand about your work?
That I'm like the super, like I'm a sheikh, like I'm Islamic law professor or scholar. Edward Said got that a lot too, because he spoke on Orientalism and Muslim rights.
Do people superimpose religiosity onto you?
They do. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. I would imagine that the 2 things that people most misunderstand are, like, one, I think people probably ask you to define critical race theory like 4 times a day.
Yeah.
And then the other is, I would imagine that they feel like they know your relationship to Islam, your personal relationship to Islam, which is funny. Whose work do you admire or are inspired by in or out of your field?
Oh, wow. So many. One contemporary author who's a good friend of mine, I really love his work, is Masoud Hayyoun, who wrote a book, When We Were Arabs. I really love his work and I love his writing.
Cool. I don't know that book, so we're going to have to reach out to him, have him on the series. Okay, cool. Let's open up to the audience. The first question is coming from Mo. Mo, I'm going to ask you to unmute. Okay, I'm going to ask his question. Thanks very much, Khaled, for your words today, and more importantly, for your efforts to shed light on Islamophobic incidents happening around the world. I'm an avid follower of your posts, particularly on news related to India, China, and the occupied Palestinian territories. How do you verify information you come across, / what news sources do you recommend? Great question.
So a lot of my work and stuff that I post comes from people on the ground. People oftentimes will DM me, email me. I have a lot of friends in India, Kashmir, people in the diaspora who are Uyghurs. So it's direct data or information from individuals or from sources that I read in sort of like in my own capacity as a purveyor of knowledge. Where do I look? Which news sources do I like? Radio Free Asia for what's happening in China. I look toward. I like the CBC, actually, Canadian Broadcasting News does a really good job. They're sort of hands off when it comes to editorializing and just providing objective assessment of news. Al Jazeera is a good source that I look toward. The BBC on some things, not everything. Democracy Now! In the States.
Cool.
I miss the Daily Star in Beirut.
Yeah. R.I.P. Ralah, I think I'm saying your name correctly. You're up next.
Close enough. It's Rala.
Rala, it's all yours. Go for
it. First of all, Professor Beydoun, I just want to stress that I don't think it falls to you to validate any of our experiences as Arab or Muslim Americans as a front-facing figure on this continent. But when you were talking about substance over identity, it occurred to me that a lot of us, myself included, are very white passing, whatever that means, and even have ancestry in areas that are now seen as Western regions. And so I'm always kind of at a loss on how to describe what the parameters of my identity are. And I know we like to de-emphasize identity, but for third culture kids like me, we're very much neither here nor there. We're not fully Arab, but we're also not fully American. We're not totally Muslim. We're not totally secular. And so to the extent that it matters, and I'll say for myself and speaking only on behalf of myself, it does matter. And largely because I found myself after moving to the States when I was 18 for college, these weird things were happening. Like I lived in Boston during the marathon bombing. And as soon as it came on the news, I was like, shit, I hope it's not one of us, which is an awful thing to think for a variety of reasons. But I always struggle to kind of verbalize and articulate who I am, why I look the way that I do, or don't look the way that I'm expected to look. And I guess, does any of that matter at all?
Yeah, so I mean, so thank you for your thoughts. I think that you echo how I feel and how many of us feel being Arab, and sort of like existing between the non-existence of racial classifications in the United States dedicated to our identities, but also to liminality of our identities in the American experience. I mean, I'll say this, I think that all racial classifications obviously are socio-political constructions, right? None of them are rooted in truth or rooted in science. And when you were speaking, it reminded me of a quote from Edward Said's autobiography, Out of Place, where he says that being out of place and being liminal is actually a space of power, right? It's a space of sort of like unique perspective and unique intellect. And I think that as I've aged, I've become a lot more comfortable with not having to sort of define or align my identity in ways that are palatable with how the state defines them. I'm not somebody who was a nationalist, right? I mean, I'm proud of being Arab, I'm proud of being Lebanese and Egyptian, I'm proud of being Muslim, but none of those things singularly define who I am. So I think it's important for us to sort of, I think part of the Imperial project is to make us feel like we have to fit within existing classifications and categories. And if you resist that and you sort of rebel against it, you're doing good work. And I think it's being in that perpetual state of out of placeness, which Edward Said articulated it as, can be a space of power.
Interesting. Great. Thanks so much for the question. The next one comes from Aisha. Aisha, just give me a second. Let me find you. There you are.
Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Thank you so much for hosting the conversation. It has been an absolute joy following along. The question doesn't have to do so much with my personal identity as it is as of a wider identity situation. So there are two things. One is how the Black Muslim narrative is almost always excluded from the wider Black Lives Matter movement. There are so many people who have died as a result of police violence, but we don't know their names. We just don't know. They're not a part of the daily media narrative. And that follows on to when Ketanji got nominated, and it happened finally that we have a Black Supreme Court justice. How soon or how many millennia will it take for a Muslim of any denomination, any cultural identity to be in places of power where it is a matter of respect? And because Ilhan Omar is still not considered assimilated with the American identity. So yeah, that's really what the question's about.
Yeah, that's a great question. I can speak for hours on sort of the spirit of the question, which sort of like leans toward the idea that, look, I'll just come on and say it, right? I think that the broader sort of like radical leftist movement in the United States is suspicious of religion, and specifically suspicious of Islam. They subscribe to Islamophobia in the same way that elements in the center and on the right subscribe to it. So when Black Muslims are, when you're Black and Muslim, there's a reluctance to want to champion victims or to champion leaders who openly identify as Muslim because they're religious individuals and they're Muslim individuals. And the left is sort of still struggling with how to reconcile the relationship with the radical, I mean, not a monolithic by any means, right? I'm not trying to say that, but for brevity, that element tends to be suspicious and skeptical of religiosity and specifically Muslim identity at large. There are individuals who are Muslims and very proud and unapologetically Muslim who are in high spaces of power. You mentioned one, Ilhan Omar. The second is a friend of mine, Rashida Tlaib, who is a congresswoman from here in Michigan. They've reached and they've maintained their sort of dignity as political leaders. But you're exactly right that even when they reach this perch, politically speaking, they're always going to be targeted in this onslaught of victimization. I mean, this onslaught of violence is always coming their way. I think to me that what that represents, and it's seldom sort of redressed, it's seldom like sort of defended by their quote unquote allies. And the reason that is because, and I say this all the time, is Islamophobia is one of the last bastions of acceptable bigotry. You can get away with it. Not only can you get away with it, oftentimes there's political points that come with it if you openly engage in anti-Muslim attitudes and animus, even in the United States.
Just to tag on to that, Khaled, have you seen, as somebody who's tracked sort of the history of this, if you take a look at the last 100 years, has the acceptability of that bigotry wavered at all?
Well, it proliferated after 9/11 because it became official state policy to discriminate against Muslims, right? You're a good American patriot if you said something and did something when you encountered a Muslim on the ground. I think has it shifted? No, I think it's still at a high point right now.
Yeah. Okay, the next question comes from, thanks so much, Aisha, for that question. The next one comes from Fadia. Fadia, are you there?
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, I follow you on social media. You're not the most artistic, but you're very efficient. So that's good. And the Daily Star is gone.
Yeah.
My question is, because I grew up in Lebanon, then I am a US citizen. I spent 30 years in the States. My kids are born and raised there. I feel like we're two people, and that makes me sad. And I don't know how bad or good that is. Like Arabs here, Muslims here, we're trying. I mean, I could get disconnected now because we have no electricity. People are trying to find food. People are trying to find medicine. It's like this in Syria, in Palestine, in Lebanon. Or you have Arabs living under authoritarian regimes. And the issues Arabs and Muslims are dealing with in the US seem like a luxury. And so I don't know which, I just wonder, are we two people, like us here, Arabs here, Muslims here, and you guys over there? That's the question.
Are we two different people? Yeah, I think we're connected by culture and identity, but we're disconnected by the places in which we live. And I think that's a fine thing. I think where you were trying to go is to say that does being comparatively privileged make us complainers in the States? Is that where you were going with that question?
I think so, yeah.
I would say no. I would say no, that just because, things might be materially better here in the United States doesn't silence us from the responsibility to speak on injustices happening in the United States. Poverty looks different in Lebanon than it does in the United States. But when I drive across the west side of Detroit, and there are students who, have dilapidated schools or have no schools or don't have enough money to, put food on the table, I know families. I was a public defender, so it's ironic that you say that my social media comes off as public defense work. I know families. I've defended individuals who have not had electricity or running water in their homes in Detroit for a long time. Detroit was a bankrupt city for many years. Let's talk about racism, right? I lived in Lebanon and Beirut for many years of my life. Anti-Black racism is existent in the country of Lebanon. You have an industry of a modern slave trade in Lebanon, where people from Ethiopia, Sri Lanka, live in enslaved conditions in the same way that slavery existed here in the United States. So I just think a simplistic comparative assessment distracts from the really important nuances and distinct forms of injustices that take place all over the world.
Khaled, real quick, just to tag on to that question, do you feel like these two fights are part of the same fight, though?
Which fights?
So these two peoples, right, that you were describing, that are connected through culture, but are separated by oceans and separated by different legal systems and different economic systems and a different bunch of stuff, right? But they are both still fighting against the sort of global Islamophobia in this case, given our conversation. Are they sort of two fronts of the same larger social justice fight?
I don't know. And I would say, I don't think there's a yes or no response to that. I think there's really important distinctions where I wouldn't make that. Look, I'm from Lebanon, right?
Yeah.
My Bayy Ali Rahmo was Lebanese. My father was Shia, right? So Lebanon is deeply sectarian. I remember as a kid, people poking fun at him and poking fun at us because of the sect that we belong to, right? I remember people poking fun at us because we didn't speak French or we weren't wealthy enough. So Lebanon is a place that has its own sort of colonial experience and its own stratifications, which are deeply divisive and have fractured that country. And the United States has distinct ones. I think there's really important and intimate connections between Arab here and Arab there, language, culture, political perspective, so forth and so on, that keep us connected, but really important distinctions as well.
Absolutely. Well, we have to end right here. Khaled, thanks so much for doing this. I really, really appreciate your time. I also appreciate your work tremendously. I constantly learn from you and from your work. This is going to go up on the podcast feed tomorrow and up on YouTube. So if you know friends who may have missed this, who want to catch up, feel free to share widely. Khaled, thanks so much and hope to see you soon.
Yeah, this is so much fun. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate this. All right, everybody, have a good day or night, regardless of where you are, and we will see you soon.